Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to ancient Rome. Not the marble columns or the dramatic speeches in the Forum. No, tonight we're talking about something far less glamorous and infinitely more tedious. What Roman soldiers actually ate while they were marching across Europe, trying not to die. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's wander slowly through the deeply unglamorous world of military rations. Because nothing says sweet dreams quite like discussing 2,000-year-old grain porridge. Now, when most people think about Roman legionaries, they picture these gleaming warriors in perfect formations, conquering half the known world with discipline and strategy. And sure, that happened. But what doesn't usually come up is that these men were also deeply, constantly obsessed with food, or more accurately, with the lack of it. Because here's the thing about marching across Germania or Gaul or Britannia, you got hungry, very hungry. And the Roman army had a solution to this problem that was both brilliantly efficient and spectacularly boring. Let's start with the basics. Every Roman soldier received a daily grain ration. This was the foundation of everything. The grain, usually wheat, sometimes barley if you were unlucky or being punished, was handed out unprocessed, just raw grain, which meant that after a long day of marching in full armor, you then got to grind your own flour. Imagine that for a moment. You've just walked 15 miles in the sun, wearing about 60 pounds of equipment. Your feet hurt, your shoulders hurt, everything hurts. And now you get to crouch down and spend the next hour grinding grain between two stones to make flour so you can eat something that vaguely resembles food. The Romans called this process making your own bread, but that's being generous. Most soldiers didn't bother with actual bread most of the time. Instead, they made something called pulse, or pulmentum. Basically, it was porridge. Very sad porridge. You'd take your freshly ground flour, mix it with water, maybe add some salt if you had it, and cook it over a fire until it became a thick, gluey paste. Sometimes you'd add lentils or chickpeas if you were near a supply depot, maybe some cheese if you'd been paid recently, but most of the time it was just grain, water, and hope. And this was what the men who conquered the Mediterranean ate every single day for years. The Romans were very proud of pulse, by the way. They considered it proper, traditional Roman food. There were even stories about legendary generals who ate nothing but pulse to show their humble, authentic Roman values, which is a very Roman way of making a virtue out of eating wallpaper paste. But soldiers, being soldiers, complained about it constantly. There were records of legionaries grumbling that they were reduced to eating barley like animals when wheat ran short, which gives you a sense of just how important these grain distinctions were. Wheat pulse was acceptable, barley pulse was an insult. Same gray sludge, different grain, entirely different emotional experience. Now, the grain ration alone wasn't enough to keep a soldier alive, obviously. So the army also provided, or rather deducted from your pay for, additional rations. Oil, usually, vinegar, almost always, salt, which was essential for flavor and for preserving any food you managed to acquire. The vinegar was especially important. Roman soldiers carried it in containers and mixed it with water to make pasca, which was the closest thing they had to a sports drink. It was sour, slightly acidic water that probably tasted terrible, but supposedly helped with hydration and made questionable water sources safer to drink. Every Roman soldier on campaign was basically walking around sipping ancient Gatorade that tasted like sadness. Then there was bacon. Well, not bacon as we know it. Lardum, salt pork, fatty preserved pork that had been heavily salted and could survive for months without refrigeration. It was given out as part of rations, and soldiers would eat small pieces of it with their pulse or bread to add some fat and protein to an otherwise carbohydrate-heavy diet. This salt pork was not crispy. It was not delicious. It was essentially a chunk of preserved fat that tasted like the ocean and had the texture of a candle. But it was calories, and calories were survival, so soldiers ate it and presumably dreamed of better times. Occasionally, very occasionally, soldiers received meat rations, beef or mutton usually. This happened more often when the army was stationary or near a city where livestock could be procured. But on long campaigns, forget it. Fresh meat was a luxury. The army did sometimes slaughter animals for the troops, especially before major battles or on festival days. But this wasn't exactly a feast. The meat would be distributed, roasted quickly over fires, and consumed immediately because there was no way to keep it fresh. One day you'd have roasted mutton, and the next day you were back to pulse and salt pork. So what did soldiers do to make this monotonous diet less soul-crushing? They foraged, constantly. As the legions marched through new territories, soldiers would spread out during rest periods to gather whatever edible things they could find. Wild fruits, nuts, mushrooms, greens, anything that might add some variety or nutrition to the standard rations. Some soldiers became quite skilled at this. They'd learn which plants were safe, which streams had fish, where birds nested. A good forager could supplement his diet significantly, maybe even trade surplus food with other soldiers for favors or items. But foraging was also dangerous. Men would occasionally get lost, or eat the wrong mushroom, or wander into hostile territory and get ambushed. The army tried to control foraging to prevent disasters, but hungry soldiers will take risks for an apple or a handful of berries. Then there was hunting. When possible, soldiers hunted game: rabbits, deer, wild boar, birds. This required time and permission, which wasn't always granted, but when it was, soldiers jumped at the chance. Fresh meat, even tough wild meat, was vastly preferable to salt pork or endless porridge. Some legions had soldiers who were particularly good hunters and would be semi-officially tasked with bringing in game for their century. These men were popular, very popular, because sharing fresh roasted rabbit with your tent group was the kind of thing that made weeks of marching almost bearable. But let's be clear, hunting and foraging were supplements, not solutions. The core diet remained grain-based, because grain was what the Roman supply system could reliably transport and distribute to tens of thousands of soldiers across vast distances. And that supply system was genuinely impressive, when it worked. The Romans built roads specifically so their armies could move quickly and be resupplied efficiently. Grain would be transported from Egypt or Sicily or Gaul to supply depots, then distributed to legions in the field. When this system functioned properly, soldiers ate regularly, if not luxuriously. But when it broke down, and it did break down, things got bad quickly. Supply lines were vulnerable. Enemies would raid supply convoys, weather would delay shipments, rivers would flood, roads would become impassable, and suddenly your legion was 3 weeks from the nearest depot with dwindling rations. In these situations, soldiers went on half rations, then quarter rations. Eventually, if things got desperate enough, they'd be eating whatever they could find: tree bark, leather from their equipment, grass. There are accounts of besieged Roman forces resorting to truly grim measures just to stay alive. But let's drift back to normal campaign conditions, where things were merely tedious rather than nightmarish. During a typical day on campaign, soldiers would wake before dawn. They'd eat a small breakfast, probably leftover pulse from the night before, maybe some bread if they'd baked it, washed down with posca. Then they'd pack up camp and march. The march itself was exhausting. Full armor, heavy pack, weapons, tools for building the next camp, miles and miles of walking, often in heat or rain, on roads that ranged from excellent Roman highways to muddy goat paths. Lunch, if you could call it that, was usually eaten on the move or during a brief rest. A piece of bread, some dried fruit if you had it, more posca. Nothing elaborate, just enough calories to keep moving. The real meal came in the evening after camp had been built. And yes, every single night, the Legion built a fortified camp. Ditches, walls, gates, a full temporary fortress. This took hours. Only after this exhausting work was done could soldiers finally cook their evening meal.
This is when they'd prepare fresh pulse or bake bread if they had time and ovens available. They'd roast any meat or fish they'd acquired. They'd sit with their contrabenium, their tent group of 8 men, and eat together, sharing food and complaining about their officers. These evening meals were the social center of military life. Men would pool resources, share stories, trade food items. If someone had managed to buy or barter for vegetables, everyone in the tent group benefited. If someone had foraged successfully, the bounty was divided. This communal eating was essential for morale and unit cohesion. Soldiers who shared meals fought together more effectively. The Roman army understood this, which is why the contrabenium system was so important. But let's be real, even these evening meals were rarely elaborate. Yes, you might have some variety, bread and cheese and onions, maybe some dried figs, possibly a bit of sausage if you were near civilization, but fundamentally, you were still eating variations on the same basic ingredients: grain, oil, salt, vinegar, preserved pork. Day after day after day, for years. Now, let's talk about what soldiers drank, because it wasn't water. Well, it was water, but Romans were deeply suspicious of plain water. They considered it unhealthy, likely to cause illness, which, to be fair, it often did in an age before water treatment.
So instead, they drank pasca, that vinegar water mixture I mentioned earlier. It was issued as part of rations, and every soldier had it constantly available. The acidity helped kill some bacteria, making dodgy water sources somewhat safer, and it provided a bit of flavor to otherwise bland drinking water. The ratio varied depending on personal preference and vinegar availability, but typically it was quite diluted, enough vinegar to taste it and theoretically purify the water, but not so much that you were basically drinking salad dressing, though honestly, some soldiers probably got close. Pasca was so ubiquitous in the Roman military that it became synonymous with soldier life. There's even that famous moment in the Bible where Jesus is offered vinegar on the cross. That was likely pasca, because it's what the Roman soldiers on duty would have had with them. They were essentially offering him a sip of their military-issue beverage. Wine was also available, but here's where things get interesting. Wine was not part of standard rations on campaign. Soldiers had to buy themselves, and they did whenever possible. But this wasn't fine dining wine. This was rough, cheap wine that soldiers would water down, sometimes heavily, to make it last longer and to avoid getting drunk on duty, which was very much frowned upon. Getting drunk in camp could get you flogged. Getting drunk on watch could get you executed. The Romans did not mess around with military discipline. So soldiers learned to pace themselves, drinking watered wine socially in the evenings, but staying sober enough to function. Beer was also consumed, particularly in northern provinces like Germania and Britannia, where wine was expensive and beer was the local drink. Roman soldiers stationed in these regions adapted to local customs, though Roman writers tended to look down on beer as a barbarian beverage, which didn't stop soldiers from drinking it enthusiastically when wine wasn't available. Now, let's talk about bread in more detail, because it deserves its own section. Bread was theoretically the preferred way to consume your grain ration, but making actual bread on campaign was complicated. You needed ovens, proper ovens, not just campfires. Some Roman camps, especially permanent or semi-permanent ones, had bread ovens built into them. Soldiers would take turns baking, producing enough bread for their units. This bread was dense, heavy, and would keep for several days, which made it practical for military use. But on the march, in temporary camps, ovens weren't always available, so soldiers would sometimes make a flatbread by cooking dough on hot stones or metal plates over fires. This was faster than building an oven, but produced inferior bread, tough, often burnt, sometimes still raw in the middle. Some soldiers became quite skilled at bread making and would barter their services, baking bread for other soldiers in exchange for other goods or favors. A man who could consistently produce edible bread was valuable. The quality of bread varied enormously depending on the flour, the skill of the baker, and what else got added to it. Sometimes soldiers would mix in beans or other legumes to stretch the flour further or add protein. Sometimes they'd add herbs or seeds for flavor. Sometimes, when grain was scarce, they'd add things that really shouldn't go in bread at all.
Sawdust was reportedly used during desperate sieges, though one imagines the resulting bread was barely edible. There's also evidence that soldiers sometimes made a kind of biscuit, hard-baked bread that could last for weeks without spoiling. These were the ancestors of hardtack, those notorious crackers that naval sailors would later subsist on for centuries. Roman military biscuits were probably similar, dry, hard, flavorless, but durable and calorie-dense. You'd soften them in water or pasca before eating, unless you enjoyed chipping your teeth. Let's drift over to the subject of cheese, which was more important to Roman military diet than you might expect. Cheese was included in rations fairly regularly because it kept well, provided protein and fat, and was relatively easy to transport. This wasn't fancy cheese. This was hard, aged, salty cheese that could survive being carried in a soldier's pack through summer heat without immediately becoming toxic. It was probably similar to pecorino or other hard sheep milk cheeses, strong-flavored, salty, and pretty much indestructible. Soldiers would eat chunks of it with bread, crumble it into pulse for flavor, or just gnaw on it during marches. It wasn't delicious, but it was food, and it was a break from endless grain products. Some soldiers stationed in regions with active cheese-making traditions would buy local cheeses with their pay, getting access to slightly better varieties. This was one of the few ways to experience any culinary diversity, buying local food when you had money and opportunity. Which brings us to an important point. Soldiers did get paid, not much, and a significant portion was deducted for equipment, rations, and other expenses, but they received some coins they could spend, and many of them spent it on food. When a legion was near a town or city, merchants would flock to the camp, selling everything from fresh vegetables to meat to prepared foods to wine. Soldiers with money could buy themselves a proper meal, something other than military rations. A roasted chicken, fresh bread from a civilian baker, actual fruit, maybe some olives or pickled vegetables. These moments of culinary relief were precious. Soldiers would save up their pay specifically to buy a decent meal, to remember what food could taste like when it wasn't prepared in bulk by exhausted men using minimal ingredients.
Some camps developed permanent markets outside their walls, with food vendors who specialized in selling to soldiers. These merchants learned what soldiers wanted: cheap, filling, flavorful food that wasn't pulse. Sausages were popular, meat pies, roasted nuts, anything that could be eaten quickly and tasted like something. But again, this required money, which not all soldiers had in abundance. The lowest-ranking soldiers, especially early in their service, might go months without being able to afford anything beyond their basic rations. Now, let's talk about vegetables, because the Roman diet, even the military diet, did include them, just not in the quantities you might expect. Onions were common, garlic too. Both kept reasonably well and were issued as part of rations or easily available for purchase. Soldiers would add them to pulse or eat them with bread and cheese. They weren't just for flavor. Romans believed onions and garlic had health benefits and would help prevent disease. Lentils and chickpeas were also standard. These legumes were distributed regularly and added to pulse or eaten as a side dish. They provided protein and made the endless grain porridge slightly less monotonous. But fresh vegetables, lettuce, cabbage, carrots, turnips, these were much rarer on campaign. They didn't keep well, they were heavy to transport, and the supply system prioritized shelf-stable foods. So unless a legion was near a source of fresh produce, a town, a farm, or a supply depot with gardens, soldiers went without. This led to nutritional deficiencies. Scurvy wasn't as common as in later naval forces because Roman armies did occasionally access fresh food, but vitamin deficiencies were definitely a problem on long campaigns. Soldiers would develop various ailments from their limited diet: anemia from lack of meat, digestive issues from the fiber-poor diet, general weakness from inadequate nutrition. The Roman army tried to address this by encouraging foraging and allowing markets near camps, but fundamentally, the system was designed for efficiency, not health. You could keep a soldier alive on grain, salt pork, and oil. You could march him across continents on that diet. It wasn't optimal, but it worked. Most of the time. Let's drift into the subject of cooking equipment, because how soldiers prepared food was almost as important as what they prepared. Each contubernium, that 8-man tent group shared cooking equipment: pots, pans, grinding stones, utensils. This equipment was carried in the group's mule cart along with their tent and other shared gear. The pots were typically bronze or ceramic, nothing fancy, just functional cookware that could handle being hauled across provinces and used over open fires. These pots would become blackened and battered, but would keep functioning for years. Soldiers would cook over open fires using wood or charcoal. Building a proper cooking fire was a skill. You wanted enough heat to cook food, but not so much that you scorched everything or wasted fuel. Experienced soldiers became quite good at this, able to judge fire temperature and cooking times accurately. Some camps had designated cooking areas to reduce fire risk and keep smoke from overwhelming the camp. Soldiers would take turns cooking for their contubernium, with each man contributing labor and ingredients to the shared meal. The grinding stones deserve special mention. These were pairs of stones, a flat base and a round upper stone, used to grind grain into flour. Using them was tedious, physical work. You'd pour grain onto the lower stone, then use the upper stone in a circular grinding motion, crushing the grain gradually into flour. This took time, a significant amount of time. Some estimates suggest it took an hour or more to grind enough grain for one man's daily bread. Multiply that by 8 men in a contubernium, and you're looking at considerable labor just to prepare the raw ingredients for your meal. Soldiers hated this task, absolutely hated it. It was seen as degrading, tedious work, the kind of thing slaves did in civilian life. But in the army, everyone ground their own grain unless they could pay someone else to do it for them. And yes, some soldiers did pay others to grind their grain for them. If you had money, you could hire less fortunate soldiers to do your grinding for you. This created a small internal economy within legions, where richer soldiers could buy their way out of the worst tasks, while poorer soldiers earned extra coins through labor. Let's talk about what happened when armies were besieged or cut off from supplies, because this is where the Roman military diet went from boring to nightmarish. When supply lines were severed, armies had to make do with whatever they'd stored and whatever they could forage or commandeer locally. At first, this meant reduced rations, half portions, then quarter portions. Soldiers would become weak, irritable, and increasingly desperate.
If the situation persisted, they'd start eating things that weren't normally considered food. Horses were typically protected because they were valuable, but in extreme circumstances, they'd be slaughtered. Dogs, if any were around. Rats became targets. Leather equipment, belts, straps, shield covers would be boiled to extract any nutritional value, though calling leather nutritious is generous at best. There are accounts from various sieges where Roman forces resorted to truly desperate measures. They'd strip bark from trees and boil it into a bitter paste. They'd dig up roots and eat them raw. They'd catch insects, birds, anything that moved. Grass was eaten, though it provided almost no nutrition and caused severe digestive problems. Some men would eat dirt mixed with water just to feel something in their stomachs, even though it obviously did nothing to alleviate actual hunger. The psychological toll of starvation was immense. Soldiers would become obsessed with food, talking about it constantly, fantasizing about meals they'd had years ago. Discipline would start to break down as men became too weak to follow orders, or too desperate to care about consequences. Commanders would sometimes execute soldiers for hoarding food or stealing rations from others, but as starvation progressed, even executions lost their deterrent effect. What's death by sword compared to death by slow starvation? Eventually, if relief didn't come, armies would surrender or attempt desperate breakouts, knowing staying meant certain death. The Romans were generally good at maintaining supply lines, specifically because they understood how quickly an army could collapse without food. But let's drift back to normal campaign conditions, where things were merely tedious. One aspect of military diet that often gets overlooked is salt. Salt was absolutely critical, not just for flavoring food, but for preserving meat and fish, for maintaining electrolyte balance during hard physical labor in hot climates, and for various medical applications. Roman soldiers received salt as part of their rations. The word salary actually comes from salarium, which originally referred to money given to soldiers to buy salt. That's how important it was.
Salt was also used as a form of currency in some contexts. Soldiers could trade it for other goods, and it held value because everyone needed it. A soldier with extra salt was a soldier who could barter for better food, repairs to equipment, or other necessities. The sources of salt varied. Coastal regions could produce sea salt through evaporation. Inland areas might have salt mines or salt springs. The Roman army ensured that salt was available to its troops because they understood that without it, both food preservation and soldier health would suffer dramatically. Now let's talk about fish, because Roman soldiers ate more fish than you might expect, especially when stationed near water. Fish could be caught fresh from rivers, lakes, or seas. It could be salted or dried for preservation. Fish sauce, garum, was a ubiquitous Roman condiment that soldiers received regularly and used to flavor their otherwise bland food. Garum deserves its own moment here. It was made by fermenting fish, usually small fish like anchovies, with salt for weeks or months until it liquefied into a pungent, salty sauce. To modern sensibilities, it probably would have smelled aggressively fishy and tasted overwhelmingly salty, but Romans loved it. Soldiers would pour garum on their pulse, on bread, on vegetables, on anything that needed flavor. It was the Roman equivalent of ketchup or hot sauce, a condiment so common that it was issued as part of military rations. The quality of garum varied wildly. High-quality garum was expensive and sought after. Military-grade garum was not high quality. It was functional. It added salt and umami flavor to food, and that was sufficient. Some soldiers stationed in coastal areas would make their own garum or buy better versions from local producers. This was one of the small ways to improve quality of life, getting access to garum that didn't taste like it had been made in a ditch. Fresh fish, when available, was popular. Soldiers would catch fish during rest periods or buy it from local fishermen. Grilled or fried fish was a welcome change from salt pork and pulse, and coastal or riverside postings were considered fortunate partly because of the seafood access. Let's drift toward the end of this section by talking about what Roman soldiers dreamed of eating. There are letters and accounts from soldiers that mention food obsessively. They'd write home asking for specific items to be sent, a particular type of sausage, dried fruit, honey, specialty breads. They'd describe meals they remembered from civilian life with the kind of longing usually reserved for loved ones. Food was more than sustenance for these men. It was comfort, nostalgia, a connection to home and normal life. A soldier stationed in cold, rainy Britannia would dream of sun-warmed figs from Italy. A man on the Germanic frontier would fantasize about olive oil and wine from the Mediterranean.
When veterans returned home after 25 years of service, one of the first things many did was seek out the foods they'd been denied for decades. Fresh bread from a proper bakery, roasted meat that wasn't salt pork, wine that didn't taste like it had been transported in a leaky amphora for 6 months. The Roman military diet kept soldiers alive and functional. It allowed the army to operate across vast distances and sustain campaigns for years. It was, in its way, a remarkable logistical achievement. But it was also monotonous, often inadequate, and occasionally dangerous. Soldiers endured it because they had no choice, because it was part of the job, because the alternative was desertion or death. And night after night, around campfires across the empire, they ground their grain, cooked their pulse, drank their pasca, and complained about the food. Just like soldiers in every army in every era have always done, and always will. So there you have it, the deeply unglamorous reality of what Roman soldiers actually ate. Grain, oil, vinegar, salt pork, and hope. Day after day, mile after mile, conquest after conquest. Not exactly the stuff of legend, but it kept the empire running, one bowl of sad porridge at a time. Rest well.